The hollow reach. I cannot pinpoint the precise moment when the silence began to encroach upon my world. It did not arrive with fanfare or violence. It slipped in, insidious, like a shadow stretching at twilight. At first, I noticed small absences. The distant hum of the city seemed fainter, the chirp of birds less insistent. These changes were subtle, easily dismissed as quirks of the environment or tricks of my mind. But the silence grew, and with it came a sense of unease that pressed against me like an invisible weight. One evening, as I walked home beneath the jaundiced glow of a flickering streetlight, the stillness became palpable. The city's usual symphony, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, the murmur of distant conversations, the faint thrum of engines, had vanished. The silence was not merely an absence of sound, but an oppressive force that seemed to choke the air itself. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the pavement, the only sound in a world that had grown eerily still. That was when I saw it. At first, it appeared as a shimmer at the edge of my vision, like heat rising from asphalt. I turned my head, and the sight struck me with an almost physical force. It was not a thing in the conventional sense, but an absence, a jagged, shifting wound in reality itself. The edges of the void trembled as if the surrounding shadows were being pulled into it, folding inward to be devoured. It radiated no light, emitted no sound. It simply was, a presence that demanded attention by the sheer impossibility of its existence. My breath caught in my throat, and my pulse thundered in my ears. I could not look away. The void seemed to pull at something deeper than sight, a primal part of my mind that screamed to flee even as it held me captive. My vision blurred, and for a moment, the world around me felt unreal, as though I was standing within a painting that had begun to decay. When I finally tore my gaze from it, the void was gone. The shadows returned to their natural places, the streetlight resumed its flickering, and the oppressive silence lifted just enough for the faint whisper of the wind to reach my ears. I stumbled home, my thoughts fragmented and fragile, as though the void had stolen something essential from me. By daylight, the world seemed ordinary again. I tried to convince myself that the encounter had been a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion and overactive imagination. But the silence lingered, clinging to the edges of my perception like cobwebs in the corners of an abandoned room. Then the gaps began. The first was small, almost dismissible, a cup slipping from my hand and shattering against the floor, yet no sound accompanied the impact. My ears strained for the sharp crack of ceramic breaking, but there was nothing. My breath hitched as I stared at the shards, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. Later, as I walked through the park, the laughter of children playing ahead dissolved mid-peal. I froze, my chest tightening as the silence rushed in to fill the void left by their absent voices. The world felt wrong, as though some unseen hand had plucked the strings of reality and left them slack. My memories, too, began to shift. A favorite song played in my mind, but the melody slipped through my grasp, its notes dissolving before I could hum them aloud. Faces I had known for years became unmoored, their details blurred as though I were trying to recall a dream that had faded with waking. It was as if reality itself was thinning, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. The more I tried to understand what was happening, the more elusive the answers became. The void had marked me, and its silence was creeping into every corner of my life. And though I tried to convince myself otherwise, I could not shake the feeling that it was watching, waiting for something I could not name. The silence deepened, spreading like a stain over my reality. It was no longer confined to sound. It began to erode the very fabric of my senses. Colors faded, their once vivid hues now muted and gray. Textures lost their definition, the rough surface of bark, the sharp edges of glass, the soft warmth of fabric against my skin all felt distant, as though I were experiencing them through a thick, suffocating fog. Food turned tasteless, its textures alien. The air around me grew cold, not in the natural way of a chill breeze, but in a manner that felt wrong, oppressive, like the void was breathing its emptiness onto my world. I felt my heart beat slow, each pulse a faint reminder that I was still alive. Yet even that rhythm seemed uncertain, as though it too could be erased at any moment. I became obsessed with the void. It was no longer a question of whether it was real. I knew it was. My thoughts turned inward, spiraling into dark corners that offered no solace. The void was watching me. I was certain of it. Even when I could not see it, its presence loomed at the edges of my perception, a constant pressure that twisted my mind. I began scouring old texts, searching for anything that might explain what was happening. My nights were spent poring over brittle pages filled with forgotten symbols and cryptic warnings, my hands trembling as I traced faded ink that seemed to whisper of horrors far older than humanity itself. But the more I searched, the less I understood. Every answer I found only led to more questions, each one darker than the last. The walls of my apartment felt closer now, as though the void's encroachment was physically reshaping the space around me. Shadows flickered where they shouldn't, and mirrors reflected not the room but something else, a space that stretched impossibly far, its angles all wrong. I stopped sleeping, unable to close my eyes without feeling the void's gaze burn into my mind. Memories began to slip away, stolen in the same silence that devoured the world around me. I looked at photographs of myself and felt no recognition. The person staring back was a stranger, their smile a hollow mockery of something I could no longer remember. Names dissolved first, of places, of objects, of myself. Then faces. I saw my reflection in a window one evening and recoiled in terror, unable to reconcile the unfamiliar features with what little remained of my identity. My thoughts fragmented, each one slipping through my grasp like water through cupped hands. I tried to hold on to them, but the more I clung, the faster they dissolved. The whispers began in the silence, faint at first, like the distant hum of electricity. They grew louder, more insistent, speaking in a language I did not understand but somehow knew was meant for me. The words burrowed into my mind, alien and cruel, urging me to surrender. The void did not need to force me. It seduced me with its promises of peace, of release, of unmaking. I found myself drawn to it, compelled to seek it out even as every instinct screamed against it. The void was no longer content to wait at the edges of my reality. It wanted more, and I feared I no longer had the strength to resist. The moment came as I had always known it would. The void no longer lingered at the edges of my perception. It erupted into my reality, pulling me into its domain. One instant, I was standing in my apartment, the walls closing in around me. The next, I was in a place that defied comprehension. The hollow reach stretched endlessly in all directions, an expanse of pure, shifting blackness. The ground beneath me was neither solid nor liquid, but something in between, trembling underfoot with a rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate with my heartbeat. There was no light, yet I could see faint outlines of incomprehensible geometries that twisted and collapsed upon themselves in defiance of logic. The air was heavy, oppressive, carrying a cold that pierced deeper than my skin. The silence here was absolute, a suffocating absence that pressed against me from all sides. My thoughts felt distant, sluggish, as though the void's emptiness had seeped into my mind. The void spoke, not in words but in visions. It opened my mind to truths that no mortal should witness, each revelation tearing at the fragile threads of my sanity. I saw stars collapsing, their final light devoured by the void. I saw timelines fracture, splitting into infinite shards that dissolved into nothingness. I saw myself, or what I thought was myself, standing alone at the edge of existence, screaming soundlessly into the dark. I tried to hold onto reality, to ground myself in the familiar, but it was no use. The void unraveled everything I knew, peeling back the layers of my existence until only a hollow shell remained. It was not cruelty that drove the void, it was inevitability. It was entropy incarnate, the end of all things. My mind splintered under the weight of its revelations. I could no longer discern where the void ended and I began. My memories were gone, my identity a faint echo that slipped through my grasp like sand through fingers. I questioned whether I had ever truly existed or if I was merely another fragment of the void, dreaming of a life that had never been. The whispers grew louder, their alien cadence drilling into the hollow spaces of my mind. Surrender, they urged. Unmake yourself. I felt myself slipping, my thoughts dissolving into the void's infinite silence. And yet, some small part of me resisted. A faint spark of defiance burned within the emptiness, a reminder that I had once been something more. But whether that spark could endure the void's unmaking, I could not say. When I returned to the world I had known, it was no longer the same. Or perhaps I was no longer the same. The void had followed me, its presence no longer confined to the hollow reach. It bled into reality, twisting it, unraveling it at the seams. Cracks appeared where there were none before, in walls, in streets, in the sky itself. They were subtle at first, mere flickers at the edges of my vision. But they grew, spreading like fractures in a mirror, revealing glimpses of something vast and terrible beyond. Angles defied logic, shifting in ways that made my stomach churn. Shadows moved when there was nothing to cast them, pooling like ink that seeped into the fabric of the world. Lights flickered, their glow uneven and wrong, casting unnatural hues that set my teeth on edge. Even the air felt tainted, carrying a weight that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The void was no longer content to wait in the periphery. It was here, and it was consuming everything. The paranoia became unbearable. I could no longer trust what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. The void's whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling every silent moment with their alien cadence. They spoke not in words but in emotions, in sensations that burrowed into my mind like parasites. I shut myself away, locking doors and drawing curtains in a futile attempt to keep the void out. I avoided the world, afraid of the cracks that had begun to appear in people as well. Faces blurred, voices dissolved mid-sentence, leaving only hollow echoes. I could not bear to see them, to see what the void had done to them. My apartment became a prison, but even here, I was not safe. The walls seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, the shadows deepening and stretching toward me. I screamed into the silence, but the sound was swallowed whole, leaving me alone with my terror. In my desperation, I began to create patterns, symbols that made no sense but felt vital. I scrawled them on walls, on paper, on my own skin, carving them with trembling hands. They were not mine, they came from the void, from the whispers that had taken root in my mind. But I could not stop. I believed, in some fractured part of myself, that they might keep the void at bay. The patterns grew more intricate, more nonsensical, until my apartment was a labyrinth of scribbles and marks. I no longer knew what they meant, only that they needed to exist. My thoughts spiraled, reality blending with hallucination until I could no longer tell the difference. I saw the void everywhere, in every shadow, in every crack. It was inside me, consuming me piece by piece. The moment of surrender came quietly, almost peacefully. I stood in the center of my ruined apartment, surrounded by the madness I had created, and felt the void's pull. It was no longer a question of resistance. There was nothing left to resist. The void had taken everything. I stepped into the shadows, into the cracks that had opened beneath my feet. The silence embraced me, and for the first time, I feel relief. The whispers fell silent, and the weight had lifted from my chest. There is no fear, no pain, only the vast, infinite emptiness of the void. My final thought is not of despair but of longing. The emptiness is no longer a predator. It is peace. To exist is to be devoured. The void remains. It always has.